Long before Natick was full of shopping plazas and elementary schools, the east coast of Massachusetts was home to thousands of native people. The ancestors of Nipmuc and Massachusetts people who live here today lived here for as many as 11,000 years. For thousands of years, the native people living here used the land seasonally. That means they moved to different areas depending on the season to plant and harvest crops, hunt, fish, and gather shellfish and berries. The Quinabequin, or what today we call the Charles River, was important because it provided villagers with fresh water, fish, and transportation. When English colonists arrived in the area, it changed the lives of the native peoples living here. English people brought with them new diseases that made the villagers sick, and a desire for control of the land, and a new religion, Christianity. John Eliot was born in England in 1604 and moved to Massachusetts in 1631 to work as a minister in a Boston church. Eliot and the other Puritans also worked as missionaries, or people who travel around teaching others about their religion and tried to convince them to join that religion. When Eliot moved to Massachusetts, he became part of a movement to convert the native people who lived here to Christianity. In order to convince others to join his religion, he needed to learn the language that they spoke first. You can't really teach others about your beliefs until you know how to talk to them. Eliot learned how to speak Algonquian languages from a Montauk man who worked near his home in Boston. His name was Cocono. After enough practice, John Eliot began visiting different indigenous communities in the area to teach them about Christianity. One of the first groups to listen to Eliot's teachings were the Massachusetts people living in a place called Kohanit, or present-day Newton, and they were led by a man named Waban. Waban was the leader of the Massachusetts people living in Kohanit. He was interested in how an alliance between the English and the Massachusetts could serve his people. Waban realized that if he agreed to follow Eliot, he and his village would be in a position of power to negotiate for protection and privileges under the English government. Specifically, Waban wanted to make sure that his people could stay in Kohanit. Waban and his followers would be moved to Natick within 5 years of his first meeting with Eliot. Natick was founded in 1651 by Waban and a group of Massachusetts and Nipmuc people under the guidance of Eliot and the English. Quellalanset, known to the English as John Speen, was a Nipmuc man who owned much of the land that is now Natick. Quellalanset agreed to sell the land to Eliot to be used for the praying town in exchange for access to the river in South Natick for fishing. Natick was founded as what John Eliot referred to as a praying town. Praying towns were English missions that Puritans set up for indigenous converts to live in under English rules. A religious mission is an established religious settlement, typically Christian, built for the purpose of converting communities. In these villages, residents had to follow English rules and traditions, and there were about 100 native people living here with their families when Natick was first established, coming together from several local indigenous nations, including the Massachusetts and Nipmuc. The early town was set up in an English style with streets and private lots for homes and farming fields along the southern bank of the river. Livestock like pigs and cows were raised in the grazing fields, while tobacco, corn, squash, and apples were harvested in neighboring fields. Instead of colonial English-style buildings, Natick's residents built wetus for their homes. Wetus were traditional homes of the Massachusetts and Nipmuc people living here, as well as other indigenous peoples in the surrounding area. Joining the praying town didn't make a native resident suddenly English. Parts of indigenous identities were kept in daily life, and you could see signs of that while walking through the streets. The wetus that were used as homes in town were a physical reminder of who lived here. Other indigenous traditions were kept in the early village when possible as well, like the wearing of special wampum accessories alongside the English clothing, and keeping local leadership under indigenous control. Lessons in the town school were taught in Algonquian languages rather than English as well. Residents were also required to follow a strict English code of conduct when they lived here, which meant cutting their hair short like the English, wearing English clothes, and following English traditions. Regular Christian services were held, presided over by indigenous leaders living in the town, like Daniel Takawambe, who later became the first indigenous man to be ordained in New England. Elected indigenous leaders oversaw daily life in the town. Many of the leaders, such as Waban, maintained leadership roles that they had held before moving to Natick. Eliot, who lived near Boston at the time, visited every 2 weeks to check in on the town. People moved to the praying town in Natick for all sorts of reasons. Some may have joined seeking protection from the English or rival native nations. Perhaps they had an interest in Christianity, or maybe they believed joining the settlement would protect their claims to the land. There's still a lot historians don't know about life in the early praying town. It's a complicated story of English, Massachusetts, and Nipmuc people coming together in this space and creating a new town for their families. What would you want to ask the families that lived here centuries ago?